Well, Dr. Winn, thank you so much for finding the time to talk with us about the Supreme Court ruling that strikes down affirmative action. What does this mean to you right now? What should it mean to all of us?
Well, I think starting off, this is not completely unexpected. The reality is, I think that this is a little bit of a reversal of the Kruger decision, which is a little bit disappointing in 2016. It seems that when I was an admissions dean, that we certainly, even back in my day as an admissions dean at the University of Colorado, had certainly made progress and moved from the concept of being able to use race as a determining factor for anyone getting admissions, to using race post sort of Kruger and beyond. Even before there was a Kruger decision, there was this ability to do what was called holistic review, in which we used race as one of a number of metrics. I think the most important thing that got pointed out today was from President Biden, who reminded everyone that when we were talking about the affirmative action, that we weren't talking about whether it was admitting people in a medical school or others. We weren't talking about admitting unqualified people. Everyone that actually was in the pool was certainly qualified, right? Because you had to meet the certain, at least standards of the institution. And so I think many of us believe that once you met the standards of the institution, then other things about where you came from, your place in space, the road traveled, we would call it, your race, and all these other things would then be additional factors. Legacy and all these other things would be additional factors that we would factor in. So I don't think anyone, that's not true. I don't think that most people will agree that using race alone is a good idea. I think most of us have moved. I think in the 1970s, there certainly was good rationale for being able to do an affirmative action sort of plan to then sort of correct what they saw were the misgivings that happened prior in the 60s, 50s, and beyond, where, prior to the 1954, the Brown versus the Board of Education, that there was separate and unequal. I think the 14th Amendment allowed that to say that there need to be, it's not separate and unequal, but there need to be equal. We all, I think, agree that all Americans and everyone needs an opportunity. I think where there may be some disagreement and where I still am a little bit confused by the ruling today is that it wasn't clear. On the one hand, we talk about getting rid of affirmative action altogether. On the other hand, it's still not clear what that actually means. There are elements of the ruling today, and again, I'm no lawyer, so I'll have to dive into it, where there are other things like bringing your own unique experiences, and other things are still, writing in an essay and all these other things. I don't really see how that was different than any of the things we had been doing, to be quite honest with you. So I'm a little bit just, again, it is what it is. Understand that we made, you would have, back in the day, the agreements from the, the Bakke decision in the 70s, which again, it was an act then to try to correct, historical misgivings by using race and using it a different way. Since the 70s, I don't think most people have done looking at picking out the best and brightest for the country that way. We haven't done that in our fellowships. I don't see where we've done that in most of our programs that have even been diversity focused. Most of those are that you have to meet the standard first, and that these were additional sort of things that could delineate or separate people. So it's an interesting time. I think it's actually probably less clear to me now than it had been before about, certainly the not using race as a primary factor. I don't think that's been done for decades. That's why this is like kind of an interesting decision for me. But it's interesting. It's interesting. We're at an interesting crossroads where I think the philosophy of wanting people to get to places on their own merit is certainly, I think, an ethos by all of us and can be agreed. But the reality is, I think that it's a little bit more complicated when you have to think in the context some of the social structures and some of the social settings that we have that do not always allow people to start off at the same starting line, if you will. So interesting.
Yeah, it's what does it mean for oncology?
Well, I think the thing that it means directly for oncology for me is that we are already struggling with a lack of diversity within our pipeline, within our field. So now we may wind up, that field doesn't just come because we snap our fingers. That field doesn't come, diverse because we have best wishes. That field that field gets diversified because we have real pipelines. Those pipelines don't just start when someone's a fellow or someone's a junior faculty or someone's a medical student. They start at the level of undergraduates. And so this ruling could theoretically wind up impacting negatively our goal of having a diverse field of people taking care of diverse patients across the country as a result of what happened today. It's inevitable. It's possible that some of our institutions could go back to the interesting bad old days, I would say, of not having even a person of color. Certainly not someone who's African-American in a classroom or as part of their programs, like it was in the 1950s, 60s, and in some cases, even the 70s. That's possible now. What's possible is that as a result of getting less diverse people in our pool as undergraduates, we then have less people to who represent diversity within our pipelines of medical students. That diversity then impacts who we actually have as residents and then fellows and then ultimately faculty and then practitioners. It's interesting because the focus, I thought, on the court would be to how do we actually make the experts doing what they've done for the last 45 years, the Harvards, North Carolinas, the VCUs, the whomever. For the last 45 plus years, schools have been able, because they've had experts, to be able to figure out how not to make race the predominant factor, or how to make race not the singular factor, but how to make what really the court just said today, just look at the whole person and tell us how the whole person stacks up based on their history, their struggles. That's what we do now. That's what we've been doing for the last 45 years. So it's an interesting sort of place to be when we're now asking places like UNC and Harvard, who literally have the experts who've been doing this for the last 45 years, who have really kind of honed in on how do we create qualified pools, and then how do we delineate those qualified pools who can then go on to acceptance to then do great things. They've been thinking about that and doing it for the last 45 years. And I would argue that it's worked reasonably well. You don't see overwhelming numbers right now. You can't actually give me a specialty where there's 50% African-Americans in anything. In family medicine, where one could say that of the 300 some odd spots in one field in the United States, that 90% of those are African-Americans. That doesn't even happen. The other thing that actually is interesting is that there had been a ruling from the lower court that did not find that these things even had a negative impact on Asians, that the things that were currently in place to, quote, encourage diversity did not have a negative impact from the data on Asians. And so the other thing that's confusing is that I'm not quite sure that the data holds up, that the programs that have been put in place have been negatively impacting other groups. So again, I think that this is where we are. It's our reality. I think that most of us have actually gone away, and many of us have gone away from using race as certainly a singular factor or the determining factor, decades ago. So we have, as cancer center directors, in my case, with a focus on trying to make sure that we reach rural populations, underrepresented groups that are at risk for cancers. This is something that potentially may have a maybe an unintended but potential negative consequence as we move down the line.
Yeah, I think I want to get your response to some of the responses that we got. We ran a survey this morning asking people what they thought about the ruling. And my sense is that some of the respondents don't necessarily get the original purpose of affirmative action. So, we have people saying things like, well, it's about time. This decision is way overdue from the Supreme Court. Medicine has always been the most egalitarian of professions, especially for healthcare. We should only be training the best and brightest to care for patients. So can you unpack that and respond to comments like that?
I think that the only field in America that has actually been based on merit solely, not your class, not your status, has been the U.S. military. Fact. I don't think that anybody else who says anything any differently will hopefully have to provide me with the data. But when it turns out that as we're looking at medical oncology and there are so few African Americans in the pipeline relative to the rest of the population, then that's not, I don't buy that. I do buy the fact that there are more than a single story or anecdotal stories of how people have joined the military and have actually raised up the ranks to become, because they have places and programs to do that without question. So the argument that science and medicine actually mirrors the military would be, I think, debunked as soon as you looked at the data. So what does it mean? What does it mean for me right now in response to most people's that I don't think most people understand what affirmative action was. Affirmative action. So let me just go back and tell you what the Brown versus Board of Education 1954 decision just meant. It meant that it addressed the issue that there was separate and unequal. And so my sense of this is that the court and others who are supportive, who said this is about time, actually probably didn't recognize that 1954 really was discriminatory, which means you couldn't get into any medical school if you were Black. You couldn't get into a Northwestern if you were Black. You couldn't because of your race. In 1954, we said, that's not fair, that you should have equal. Now, the issue is, that's one thing that says, let's stop the racism, or let's stop these structures from getting in the way. But that's one that says, well, quit it, cut it out, right? That's what the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education decision was. It was, hey, wait a minute, stop your activities. This is not fair. But how do you account for the multiple years up till the time when you said stop? Mm-hmm. In 1970, it wasn't this crazy left-wing liberal thing. It was many people, bipartisans, by the way, who actually tried to figure out, we've stopped this, but we did not account for how to make it fair. What fair? I mean, we, for X number of years, since 1619 until that decision in 1954, we were separate and unequal. In fact, sometimes not even, separate and equal, but most of the time it was separate and unequal. So they said, stop that. So when you stop that, what did that mean? For some in America, what it meant was that we should, out of what would be called social justice, if you will, or through the lens of racial justice, or whatever you take a look, those politicians, those leaders in the field of law, what have you, said, you know what, in the good spirit, we should try to correct that, right? And they did. Then you had the 1970s Abaki decision and all the rest of that, right? Where we sort of said, I think that was Justice Powell who said, listen, you cannot talk about correction or racial justice or all that. That can't happen. We can't have you picking people in colleges. We know you mean well, but we just can't have you doing it just based on race. And so post that decision was this narrow decision to say, right, you can't put someone just because they're Black and they suck. I don't think that was ever the case, by the way. If you look at the affirmative action, you always had to meet the standards. That's what gets missed. No one made a lowering of the standards. They said you had to meet the standards. If you didn't meet the standards, then you weren't in the pool. So the funny part about this is that now that we've gone beyond saying we haven't done that for a very long time. So the decision today is a little confusing because I'm like, well, what problem are you solving? Because that was, we dealt with that issue. We've even done with the issue of, well, how could you use it? And this is where you had the justice, this is back in Justice Powell, right? Where you can't talk about in 1970s. And then all of a sudden we had all these things with, Justice Kruger and all the rest of this with the, unanimous decision and the Humphreys decision about the use of using, this sort of or limited use of race, that it can be considered to be a factor, not the factor. I don't see how the ruling today has, in one way or the other, cleared that up, because it seems to me that it is not clear that that what happened today is to say that, the use of one's history, one's person, one's neighborhood, one's experiences don't matter. It seems to me that what they're saying is you just can't say, well, the person is Black, therefore, right? Which I think, in some ways, no one's been doing that for decades. So I am perplexed.
So what happens is, as a former dean of admissions, as a cancer center director, and really as an educator of doctors now, of oncologists, through the Winn.
It's not the ruling I'm worried about, it's the overreaction to the ruling.
Okay.
So from what I understand today, you could still use issues around hardships. You could still use issues of including racial discrimination. You can use many of these issues. So for me, the issue is, I understand what the courts just said, but it will be the overreaction or the lack of real attention to detail that what happened today didn't just say, well, now all of a sudden you can't consider, certainly you can't consider race alone, but we haven't done that since the 70s, I hope. So again, you're forcing us to do what many of the medical schools already have adapted when I was a medical student with the AAMC, which is holistic review. I as an admissions dean, I never looked at a person's color. I looked at the person as a whole. I never looked at the person's total gender as being a deciding factor. I looked at the gender that they were as a whole. I never looked at the fact that they were rural as the deciding factor. The rule was the fact that they were part of something. That's like looking at them as they were a Division I athlete. That was not the deciding factor. It was how their academics, how their integrity, how quick they were to learn, what experiences actually, and what you can't do on papers is the grit, right? And the fire in the belly. Those are all things that don't always jump out on a paper, which is one of the reasons why I think that today, this decision was a little bit confusing to me, because to be quite honest with you, most places have been doing that for a very long time. Look at California. I mean, as a result of what kind of happened with the last things that, before, these rulings, they narrowed down the decisions, right? So they use race as a factor, but not the factor. And what it's resulted, unfortunately, in a number of the California schools still having less minorities now than they had before. So for me, it's an interesting place to be as a cancer center director who is unapologetic that my role is not to take care of just the people who could get to me, but those people who are in need of good cancer and who are in need of the best and brightest scientists to figure out mechanisms, not only how to bring the life to a molecule, to a medicine, but how to get that medicine out to the greatest number of people who are in need. That too is something that we should dream about doing. And to be quite honest with you, I think that anyone who says that, that medicine is always the most egalitarian, they clearly should say the same thing about the ballet and the opera and everything else. You got to be kidding. The only egalitarian outfit in the entire United States is, since the days of FDR and his wife, has been the military. And so for me, this is an interesting day because I'm not quite certain what we've not been doing over the last X number of decades, because we certainly have not gone away from what some people would consider the bad old days. That's a judgment issue from the 1970s of using race as a really predominant sort of factor about getting into these schools. That has not been the case for such a long time.
I think the other question, and this might be up for debate for legal scholars about how they apply this ruling, but as you know, the NIH and NCI has been working hard to increase diversity in the cancer workforce. And it's unclear whether this is only limited at admissions for universities and higher education, or does it have other impacts on, say, how NIH looks at grants, or or whether people need to, since researchers sometimes need to report their underrepresented status, including race and ethnicity. I wonder if this is only just limited to admissions.
Yeah, that's going to be the question that we will, I think, be thinking about and sort of seeing how it evolves over time. Obviously, I think those who can be incredibly fearful will shut down their shops now for fear of having any sort of lawsuit being brought that hints of anything that actually has to do with having any sort of thing that even hints of affirmative act, which is interesting. I don't know. I think that there could be a potential negative impact on certainly many of the partnerships that people do, particularly because we're trying to actually impact or increase diverse workforces around the country. It's an interesting time because, I think you would have to go back to President Lee Bollinger, who I think is at Columbia right now, who had previously been at Michigan right around this time, I think in 2003 or whenever. And I think that he has a very interesting perspective on this, that he believes that the reality is that the diversity amongst his undergraduates and his graduate programs and et cetera, medical programs, has actually done a lot of good. In fact, I think recently he did, I can't remember, but I remember seeing him and him stating that even getting rid of, quote, the standardized test did not reduce the quality of the class. That the standardized test was used for egalitarian reasons, but actually those standardized tests have been used even more so as tools, right, against certain groups. And the interesting thing is, getting rid of the standardized test didn't mean that he had lesser quality. I mean, that's Lee Bollinger. That's me, not me. You can quote him. But I think that looking at it from a president of a university and looking at it from the eyes of a cancer center director, what I worry about is that there will be an overreaction, a reflex to become more conservative in our goals of getting diverse people that ultimately we know can go out in diverse communities. And at the end of the day, what I worry about is that this move, not immediately, but down the line, could jeopardize and could have a negative impact on the types of patients that I take care of. The people in rural communities, the people in poor communities, the people in underrepresented, that are living urban areas of underrepresented group members. I fear that this could produce even smaller numbers of people who are even interested in taking care of those people. And so while we have our science that clearly is going to get better and better over time, the question is, will that science really be able to impact most of the people in our communities, or will it only impact the benefits of that science impact few people in our communities? And I think that that's the question that I wish on some level that this court and all of us would start considering as we're talking about what's our ultimate goal. Is our ultimate goal just to have smart people for smart people's sake, which is cool, bringing knowledge for knowledge's sake, or is this really a goal of enriching Americans so that we have a diverse group of Americans that can serve a diverse group of Americans when it comes to health? And that's the issue that I have no questions about. I go to sleep every night. The court decisions, what the court decisions, but there is another North Star. I understand the legal, but there is a moral star that we actually have to all point ourselves to, particularly in the health field, of are we doing the best by our patients in our communities? And if people can go to sleep at night thinking that we're narrowing this decision and maybe having a less diverse workforce, et cetera, that they're okay with that, then, they got to do them. But I would say for me, my moral North Star is pointed in the direction of making sure that our science just doesn't serve some who can afford it, but that the science benefits Americans, including the people from neighborhoods that I come from.
Let's boil it down a little bit, because I hear from you that that the decision is probably not going to be far-reaching, at least as it is written, because things have been done exactly as they say they should be. So the thing to fear is an over-interpretation, overreaction to the decision.
And an overall chilling effect.
Yeah. So what should the right approach be? Can you suggest some guidelines to your colleagues who run cancer centers, medical schools, fellowship programs?
I actually think the following. I think that the ultimate goal is still, let's take clinical trials. The ultimate goal, we know that in the 21st century, when you run out of the standard of care, in the 21st century, the standard of care is to have access to clinical trials. Number two, we clearly understand that the number of people in the United States, certainly on clinical trials, is low relative to other countries, but it is an astounding fewer number of people from rural, poor, and say ethnically diverse and racially diverse communities. So if the standard of care, right, when we run out of the standard chemo things, is to actually have access to all Americans of our miracle drugs through the access of and the learning through trials, then we're not doing a great job. How are we going to do a better job? Well, there is an approach that says we can do a better job by diversifying the workforce. And by diversifying the workforce, that there will be others who will be interested in solving the big problem that we have in the United States of getting our best and brightest to deliver the best and brightest, deliver the best and most high impact to all Americans. That's not going to just happen without having some efforts. So I actually think that the goal isn't so much to get Black folks as it is to get the right folks to be able to reach the right people at the right time with the right message. Mm-hmm. And so for me, this is really more of I hear you in the context of the law, but I hear you in the context of the law and how it actually also has to align as a physician, as a clinician, as a researcher with my moral North Star that points towards humanity, that all people deserve the access to benefits of the magic and the miracle drugs we create. So for me, this means that the programs that we've built over time should stay. The programs that we are thinking about building to increase not only diversity, but increase the knowledge and approaches about how to reach these populations of people should continue. The number of fellows, as we've been talking about, I really believe that what happened today could have a needless, and I mean needless, overreaction and chilling effect on increasing the pipeline of diverse minority candidates that could be, oncology fellows. I don't want minority oncology fellows just because they're minority oncology fellows, but I want minority oncology fellows to increase in numbers because of what I believe the impact they can actually have on our communities and therefore the health of America.
Yeah.
Now, someone can argue against that, but I think we have history and data to show that we're not doing such a great job now. So unless there's another model, that was the working model. Mm-hmm. That was the model that I would put my money on. That was the model that probably was going to be put my money down that was probably going to be the most effective model. And the question becomes, if that stops, and God forbid, we have 5 to 7 years from now, less than 1%, say, African-Americans that are oncologists, what will we do as a country? What will we do as a health field? And how will that impact the kinds of questions, scientific questions that are also being asked? Those are my worries.
So I guess one final question is, how does your world change today, or does it?
The world is, for me, as it ever was. There is a moral and ethical North Star that certainly, as a respected and respectful US American citizen, I will obey the law. But I will also understand that that law and obeying its rules does not negate or does not change the effort in making sure that diversity in the United States matters. I think that laws will certainly come and go. We've seen that now, and that's not what I used to think, but laws now, they do come and go. But the ethical and moral arc of our North Star and what we should do is timeless. It's based on the principles of humanity. It's based on the principles of understanding that I didn't go just to school as an African American just to learn medicine to take care of African Americans, but whoever came to my door. It also meant that as an African American, that there were some unique challenges, not only in getting to be a doctor, but even remaining a doctor or being a cancer center director that won't jump out on anybody's paper. There are things that I won't talk about because, in fact, the reality is talking about them is just a distraction. But they're there. But the issue is that has never been my goal or anybody else's goal, to use those things to, quote, talk about why we need more help or whatever. Those things are just as they are. But can you imagine a world in which there isn't an African-American voice at the table? Can you imagine a voice? I mean, can you imagine a world of hematology, oncology, understanding that the number one group that dies from lung cancer, and that there are 2 times African Americans, and that there are, if you're an African American in this country, in the US, you're 2 times more likely to die from prostate cancer, and as a patient, not have access to anyone that actually even understood your neighborhood, not just because they were Black, but maybe understood from a cultural and social issue the right messaging that needed to get you to say yes to our current therapy. Imagining such a world is frightening for me.
And
so I stick by the same principle that ultimately the goals remain the same: to put our best and brightest and most diverse people within the United States to serve the greatest number of Americans through our health field and in our field of cancer. That is a goal that is not changeable for me.
I was gonna say, I can't imagine a world without MLK being at the table.
I mean, come on. I mean, can you imagine with no Latinos, no African Americans, no whatever? I mean, it's possible. But I hope that none of us actually see that as the best possible outcome and the best possible world and the best possible good for the United States.
Dr. Winn, thank you so much for your time.